So you will say that the training of the mind and the contemplative training definitely help us to recognize the emotion and to regulate the emotion in this interception of the body, isn't it?
Well, there's no question that research shows that various kinds of contemplative practices can be beneficial in helping people to regulate their emotion. With regard to introception, the findings are very complicated and not at all straightforward. In fact, we have contributed to that scientific literature, and we have done several studies looking at objective measures of introceptive ability. And this is a bit of a long story, and I'll make it short for this purpose, but we have not found that introceptive ability is easily modified by meditation. And we've looked at several different forms of meditation. Now, that doesn't mean it can't happen, but it's complicated, and there may be some specific kinds of practices which are helpful, but basic mindfulness practices do not seem to modify our introceptive capacity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So did you find that some other type of meditation help? You say mindfulness, it doesn't, but maybe compassion or resiliency does?
Yeah, it hasn't been studied systematically yet, so we don't know, but certainly that's a possibility. And, based on other considerations, we would expect compassion to be perhaps more beneficial in improving this capacity.
Okay, let's go to translate, and we go back about what changed the interception, what we can do, if we can do something, ¿no? That will be a good question. Le preguntaba al doctor si las prácticas contemplativas y el entrenamiento de la mente nos ayudan a regular las emociones, podrían ser un agente sustantivo en la modificación de la interocepción. Y él dice, es muy buena pregunta, pero los estudios que nosotros hemos hecho hasta ahora en neurociencia, hemos observado que para modificar la interocepción no es fácil. Y no es fácil modificarlo incluso desde la meditación. Puedo decir lo que no funciona, y lo que no funciona y no modifica nada la interocepción es el mindfulness, no lo hace para nada. Y le he preguntado, bueno, si no lo hace mindfulness, ¿hay otro tipo de prácticas que podría hacerlo, como por ejemplo la compasión o la resiliencia? No lo sabemos todavía, solamente abre espectros de posibilidades de que podría ser más benéfica, pero lo que sí que sabemos es hasta ahora lo que no, y es que el mindfulness no lo es. Good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, I would love to go to another question, who is also very interesting about, let me put you the slide so like that we can read it, because you have been speaking about my second question. This is about plasticity on the brain. I would love just to open the floor about the interplay between the brain plasticity and consciousness. What about the connection and interaction existing between the brain's capacity for plasticity and the state of consciousness that individuals experience? La pregunta sería, ¿cuáles son las conexiones y las interacciones que se dan entre la capacidad de la neuroplasticidad y los estados de conciencia dentro de las personas?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. And really, the simple answer is we don't really know. But I'm certainly happy to speculate a little bit about this. First, we do know that brain plasticity exists throughout life. And there's very, very good hard-nosed evidence to show this. So it's not the case that plasticity is present in children and then somehow ends. There are sensitive periods of development where there's increased plasticity, but we know that plasticity occurs throughout life. The second thing that we know is that certain forms of plasticity are essential for new kinds of learning. And learning is enabled by brain plasticity. If our brains were not capable of changing, we wouldn't be able to engage in many of the forms of learning that come spontaneously and very naturally. With regard to states of consciousness, it does seem to be the case that the capacity of the brain to reorganize in different configurations is associated with our capacity to shift our consciousness. And let me be more specific about that. There are people who may be stuck in a certain space. For example, a depressed person who is chronically unhappy is unable to think of him or herself in a positive way, has very negative beliefs about themselves. This is kind of an attractor loop where a person is really stuck in a particular state of consciousness. And there's some evidence to suggest that in those people, the very mechanisms of plasticity itself are impaired. And one of the really important ingredients of treatments to help people like that are ways of inducing increased neuroplasticity. And in fact, one of the really interesting findings to emerge in modern neuroscience over the last decade is that the class of medication that is used for depression, called SSRIs like Prozac, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, the primary mechanism for those kinds of drugs actually is to increase brain plasticity. And if you interfere with the drug's capacity to increase brain plasticity, you actually interfere with the antidepressant effectiveness of the medication. So I'm not someone who's, a big promoter of these kind of medications. I think there are ways to do this without medication, but it's interesting that one of the most commonly adopted forms of treatment is one that actually increases brain plasticity.
Okay, very good. Let's go to translate. Bueno, estábamos hablando sobre la relación entre la conciencia y la plasticidad del cerebro, y la primera cosa que él dice, bueno, la verdad es que no lo sabemos muy bien, pero vamos a trabajar bajo dos hipótesis. La primera es que la plasticidad es una cualidad que está a lo largo de toda la vida. A lo largo, evidentemente, es más intensa en ciertos periodos sensitivos de la existencia, como por ejemplo los niños, los adolescentes, etc. Y la segunda es que hay formas de plasticidad que son esenciales y que a veces esas formas que son esenciales se paran de alguna manera, se detienen, y otras se aumentan. Bajo estas dos premisas podemos decir que la conciencia en relación con la plasticidad es la capacidad que tiene el cerebro de reorganizarse, de reconfigurarse, y que no necesariamente esa capacidad tiene que ver con cambiar los niveles de conciencia. Voy a poner un ejemplo. Imaginaros a alguien que se ha bloqueado en un espacio en un tiempo determinado. Ese bloqueo le podemos llamar depresión. que no es capaz de ver lo positivo y solamente es capaz de ver lo negativo de la situación. En ese loop de movimiento negativo, los mecanismos de plasticidad se han detenido. Y está claro que el tratamiento para sacar a la persona de esas situaciones, volver a mover la plasticidad de su cerebro, volver a hacer que circulen aspectos mucho más positivos. Y la investigación dice que algunos de los medicamentos que se han usado para ello, justamente lo que hacen es promover la plasticidad cerebral. Por ejemplo, uno de los medicamentos más famosos, que es el Prozac, lo que hace es ayudar a mover la plasticidad cerebral. Yo no soy un gran promotor de los medicamentos, pero lo que está claro que se podría hacer de otra forma, pero que el Prozac en este caso sí que ha movido la plasticidad cerebral. That's very interesting. So you mean that the plasticity of the brain, if I understood, is not necessarily related with the level of consciousness, isn't it?
Well, it's related in the sense that increased plasticity allows you more flexibility in states of consciousness or levels of consciousness. Um, when there's decreased plasticity, there is less capacity to change. There's more of a stuck quality.
Ok, entonces, como llevando a la conclusión la pregunta, ¿es la plasticidad un coayudante de favorecer los estados de conciencia o no lo es? Repite, lo que la plasticidad hace es abrir en ciertos sentidos la posibilidad a que haya más movimiento en todo y por lo tanto más movimiento en los campos de conciencia. Cuando se aumenta la posibilidad y cuando se decrece la posibilidad. Yes, this is really interesting, and you was starting speaking about mental disorders, no? And that was one of my questions, Richie, about how disorders like depression or anxiety can significantly impact our level of consciousness. No, you have speak about that, or it's more about the level of consciousness regarding plasticity or the level of regulate the emotions. What is the effect? La pregunta es cómo los trastornos como la depresión, algunas cosas que ha empezado ya a hablar, pueden incidir en la capacidad de regular nuestras emociones. ¿Es más un trastorno de la conciencia? ¿Es más de la regulación emocional? ¿De qué es?
Yeah, so this is an important and broad question. We know that disorders like depression and anxiety have pervasive effects on the mind, the brain, and the body. Phenomenologically, when a person is suffering from depression or anxiety, their subjective experience is, of course, altered. A person who is highly anxious interprets events in the world as potential threats, even when they're objectively neutral. This is one of the characteristics of anxiety. Everything becomes an occasion for a threat. And so the very mechanisms of attention and perception are altered. We know the brain is altered in people who are suffering in that way. There again is evidence to show that people who are suffering from anxiety and depression related disorders have decreased neuroplasticity. So not only are they suffering from the disorders, but they're stuck. And that's really part of the definition of the disorder. It's actually natural and adaptive for every one of us to experience symptoms of anxiety and depression sometimes. I mean, if we have a tragic loss in our lives, if a loved one passes away, it's appropriate to experience sadness. And so the real issue is our capacity to bounce back, our capacity for resilience, our capacity to recover, our capacity to regulate. And this is where plasticity and awareness comes in, because the more plasticity and the more awareness we have, the greater the capacity to regulate and to be resilient and to change, and not to get stuck. So this is something, very, very important. And when we engage in contemplative practice and cultivate qualities of awareness, we are strengthening our capacity to regulate our mind and our brain, and to increase plasticity. And this is something that is enormously beneficial in decreasing the likelihood that we get stuck in any one state.
Exactly.
So, and just to add one other piece to this, one of the implications is that there's a certain kind of flexibility that is cultivated through contemplative practice. And this flexibility, this fluidity, is really so important. And after you translate, I'll give one example of this.
Yes, we will need to know what kind of contemplative practice induce plasticity and what not, because you was identifying very clear what mindfulness does and not, and that will be after the translation, if you don't mind. Bueno, vamos a ver exactamente, hemos hablado del efecto que puede tener la plasticidad y la conciencia en las enfermedades mentales, ¿no? Y lo que vemos claramente es que en enfermedades, por ejemplo, como la depresión no solamente afecta al cuerpo y a la mente, sino que tiene efectos en el cerebro. La experiencia de estar alterado por ver una circunstancia amenazante, aunque esa circunstancia sea en realidad neutra, la persona la percibe como amenazante, está relacionado con los niveles de atención y con los niveles de percepción. Entonces, la ansiedad provoca menos plasticidad y por lo tanto menos capacidad de adaptarnos a lo que sucede. Está claro que cuando nos sucede un evento determinado, como por ejemplo una pérdida, un dolor, una situación grave, es normal que nuestros mecanismos de adaptación nos detengan y nos digan, te tienes que concentrar en esto, ¿no? Pero también es normal que pasado un tiempo nosotros tengamos que tener la capacidad de salir de ese estado, la capacidad de ser resiliente, de regular esa experiencia inicial de la emoción que nosotros teníamos. ¿Qué es lo que regulamos? Regulamos la atención y la percepción y regulamos, por lo tanto, la emoción que hemos sentido inicialmente. Está clarísimo que ciertas prácticas contemplativas ayudan a nuestra capacidad de regular la mente y por lo tanto inciden en el cerebro, aportan mayor plasticidad y por lo tanto desbloquean aquellos obstáculos que inhiben la plasticidad. Le llamamos la flexibilidad de la práctica contemplativa.